When I saw this little horse at the auction, I knew I had to help him. I ended up paying $250. He was an untrained stud colt who was also fairly emaciated. I knew I was going to have to be very careful refeeding this horse. He was around a 1.5 on the Heineke scale. While he did still have a little bit of muscle mass on him, he had no fat anywhere on his body. His shoulder blades and spine were very prominent. I could feel every single vertebrae that he had. Depending on the angle that you looked at him, you could see his hook and pin bones in his hips and every single one of his ribs. Despite his horrible condition, he was a super friendly horse. When I was able to get a closer look at him, I found that he had what I thought was a piece of wood or metal stuck in his chest. In addition to the foreign body, he had a big scar underneath that also felt abnormal. I was a little bit worried about it, but he had a long way to go before he was healthy enough to undergo any type of surgery. I always use UC Davis's protocol for refeeding starved horses, and by day 3 there was a little bit of sparkle in his eye. On day 8 I did start adding a little bit of beet pulp to his alfalfa mash. He really seemed to like the beet pulp in more of a soup. This stuff works really well because when you soak it, it puffs up, so it's a really high fiber feed that can get their guts moving along a little bit faster. On day 10, I could start to breathe a little bit easier because he was out of the initial refeeding window. After a couple weeks of all the alfalfa he could eat, I was ready to start working him a little bit. This horse proved to be extremely gentle and kind, and I had no trouble getting him saddled for the first time. I did try and contact the owners that brought him to the sale, but like most emaciated horses in his condition, I usually never get a return phone call. I could tell that this guy had been handled at one point, and his owners probably fell on hard times and were unable to keep feeding him and then had to take him to a sale. He is the perfect example of a horse that just needs a second chance. After he was fully vaccinated, I went ahead and put a buddy in with him. This is my go-to guy for teaching manners. He is 28 years old and he is perfect at getting these horses to understand how to act in a small herd. When I first get a lot of these horses, they don't really have a lot of personality. But once they start feeling healthy and they get to have friends, it's a whole different story. I've been calling this horse Skeletor, and although he is starting to gain a lot of muscle mass, the name just kind of stuck. It was really nice to see him playing and kicking up his heels and getting to be out on the grass with another horse. Skeletor got to live in a stall with a run and then get turned out every day to play and run and jump and stretch his legs. Because he was now fully vaccinated and pretty healthy, it was time for him to get gelded. Most people will not buy a stallion at an auction, especially one that is so skinny. When an unhandled stallion ends up at an auction, especially a lower end one, they usually sell for less than $500. In the last couple years, I have been buying a lot of stallions from auctions just because they usually are the most at risk of the horses that I see. Even before Skeletor was gelded, he was very calm and sweet. Every time he started looking a little bit plump, he would shoot up and grow again. When I first bought him, I thought that he might be a little cow horse because he wasn't very big, but he just continued to grow taller and taller, so I think that he's probably got some thoroughbred in him. When the vet finally came out to geld him, we also decided to explore what was in his chest. The foreign body that was right on the surface came out super easy, and it was a little stick. While he was sedated, the vet also felt around in his scar and felt what he thought was another piece of wood. He ended up having to go pretty deep within the muscle, but he eventually ended up pulling out another tiny stick. These two sticks were totally encapsulated in the muscle and were not infected at all. I spent a week cold hosing his incision sites, and I got him to trot around a little bit every day so he healed properly. I could still feel his shoulder bones and his spine, so I decided that I would go ahead and give him the entire winter off for growing. He got to be in the barn, and then he got to be turned out with a friend for most of the day. Every time I thought he was done growing, he would just shoot up again. Throughout his entire rehab, he was such a character. He usually acts more like a dog than a horse. He'll follow me around everywhere that I go and just want me to snuggle on him all day long, which makes doing chores really hard sometimes. This horse always had a little bit of trouble figuring out where his legs were at, but as spring rolled around, you could tell that he had figured it out. My favorite kind of horse to rehab are little cow horses, but I have dabbled in just about every discipline there is, so when I have a horse come along that trots as big as this guy, I know that I can do him justice in his future training and get him in a discipline that he'll be really good at. This horse has a very immature mind, so even though his body was probably ready to be started under saddle, I decided to let him grow up for a few more months and just get to be a horse. This guy will stay with me for a few years, and because he's great and has no papers, I went ahead and I put my brand on him just to keep track of him. When the grass finally came up for the year, I decided to turn him out with the herd, which he was a little bit hesitant about at first. He had never really been in a herd setting and kind of had a hard time figuring out where he was at among all the other horses. He was incredibly fast, so whenever he got himself into trouble, he would just run away. He eventually fit in, and during the summer, he was looking spectacular. After a long rehab like his, sometimes it's hard to remember what they look like when they first come to my barn. He continued to grow all summer long. He continued to have a little bit of trouble developing his top line, so I made the decision to turn him out for the rest of the summer and fall on some big round bales of alfalfa so he could eat as much as he wanted. He's definitely now over 15 hands. He is still super curious and friendly, and it is about time that I actually started him under saddle. Buying a horse like this from a teeny tiny auction and then spending 18 months rehabbing them can be a big undertaking. But the next few months when I start him under saddle will be very exciting and totally worth the wait.